All right, so this week we are discussing the robber barons, the Gilded Age, much of what's going on after Reconstruction. And I want to discuss the ideas which led to the application of these things, such as the robber barons and major capitalist maneuvers, etc. So today, what I want to discuss is the study of mentalities, or mentalite, from the historical tradition, from the Annals school, the idea of a zeitgeist, that ideas of people, and not just of elites, the ideas of the common people and why they thought that they did the way they did. So we're going to talk a little bit about laissez-faire mentality, the origins of the general welfare state, and included in this is social Darwinism. And many people should be aware of what social Darwinism is. Just specifically, it's the survival of the fittest, the idea that the strongest, the smartest will survive. They will make the most progress. And so there is obviously a connection between that and capitalism, free market capitalism, as well as the laissez-faire mentality, which we'll get to in a second. Now, social Darwinism was a popular strain of thought in the late 19th century, and it worked hand in hand, again, with laissez-faire. Herbert Spencer was the most popular proponent of social Darwinism, even though he did arguably act against its main theories. Herbert Spencer, again, is considered kind of the father of social Darwinism at this time. So let's get to laissez-faire. Now, in the late 19th century, there is a conflict within American thought regarding economic and political functions of the government. Now, in many ways, this was a conflict that had always existed and would continue to exist, simply the degree of its impact being the major issue. During the Constitutional Convention, this division was associated with Federalists and Anti-Federalists, or those who favored a strong central government and those who believed in decentralized government with limited power. The proponents of each, Federalists were people like Alexander Hamilton and John Adams. Anti-Federalists were Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine. Laissez-faire was one side. The ideal of the general welfare state was the other. Now, within this, we have what's called the negative state, which would be laissez-faire, or the idea that the government does not take action, versus a positive state, or the general welfare state, the idea that the government is a positive and needs to act both reactively but proactively as well. We also have the idea of determinism, the immutable natural law which cannot be altered, versus free will, or change, relativism, find ways to fix problems and then in a way that they can be fixed, the idea that nothing is inevitable. Now, what does laissez-faire mean? Literally, it means hands off or let alone. It relates to the ideal of limited government. Now, and along with this is this idea of free will, the idea that people make decisions for themselves, and that is what we should do. We should leave people to decide, to render decisions for themselves. Now, why was laissez-faire so popular? There are many reasons. The origins of the country itself, the Declaration of Independence, for example, the agrarian model of Thomas Jefferson, the belief in natural rights and that our rights come from God or nature, which means what regarding our rights? Means belief in self-sufficiency of the individual, that people can affect change without the help of the government, that the government should not be involved in that. This also relates, again, directly to the idea of free market capitalism. The government should be hands-off, and that should allow the markets to dictate how the economy goes. Now, why would proponents of social Darwinism espouse laissez-faire? Again, the idea the government just gets in the way of the most advanced individuals and businesses. The government interrupts this natural process of the best asserting their quality thusly. So a social Darwinist would espouse laissez-faire because a social Darwinist would believe that any individual or business will succeed if it is strong and smart. Thus, the government should not be involved. Let the people themselves decide. Now, laissez-faire is also connected to capitalism. Again, it provides the rationale for free markets, which I've kind of already touched upon. Now, laissez-faire, again, was the dominant thought process at the time, and the government and the courts agreed, and they facilitated the rise of big business, which you will read about this week. But this would not have been possible without this embrace of the laissez-faire mentality. The courts were conservative in general. They were proponents of the status quo. There is a belief in limited government as prescribed by the Constitution and its founders. The implied limits on legislative powers was due to the very nature of these free institutions, again, free from interference. The narrow view of functions of government What did the founders and these folks consider the purview of the government? Again, it was a very narrow view of the functions. The role of the government, very specifically, and this was from the founders and many who espoused this ideal after, the basic role of the government is to protect the citizens. So it is a military issue, police force, other similar services, and provide basic infrastructure such as roads. An active government was considered the enemy of true liberty. So again, this is what the founders had proposed, this is what their followers had proposed, and this is what most Americans had always subscribed to for a long time. State courts would render many decisions which further limited the power of local and state governments. They equated action to paternalism. There was support of employers regarding contracts and each man for himself. Again, the idea of social Darwinism. Now, the courts also expanded the interpretation of the 14th Amendment and due process to corporations as well as individuals. Now, this is significant because the courts thus limited the power of state governments as well as federal governments with regard to corporations because, again, they're individuals, and it's the idea that let the individuals decide for themselves, also let corporations decide for themselves. So we have this limited purpose with regard to the federal government. Congress can exercise its granted powers with limited purposes only, or it could encroach upon state powers reserved by the 10th Amendment. And this all gets back to that clever 10th Amendment. If you're not familiar with that, I highly suggest and recommend reading it so you further understand the origins of this view of decentralized power, of limited power of the government. Now, on the other side, we have laissez-faire. Now, on the other side of that, we have general welfare state. And this was promoted by Protestant clergy, those who were involved in what was called the social gospel movement. And what that was basically ministers were applying Christianity or Christian values to what was going on in politics. So that is why even today we see many ministers, many preachers who subscribe to a stronger government presence because they feel that's necessary to help the people. And basically what they see is the government applying these Christian values, these Christian principles, this Christian action to political realities to help people. So we have the Protestant clergy, the social gospel movement. We also have science. Now, Lester Ward and the sociology movement, pragmatists like William James, political scientists found problems with the let alone policy and tried to ameliorate these with their different theories. Now, again, the social gospel was occupied with ethics of free market capitalism. It emphasized saving society, not the salvation of the individual, but again, the salvation of society. This was a reaction to the individualism of traditional Protestantism, which we've discussed in the past, and business, and it applied principles of Christianity to the problems of the times in an effort to regenerate society so that the individual could lead a true Christian life. Now, with regard to political science, we have the new political economists versus the classical political economists. And the new political economists believed that economic laws were not absolute, but that they were relative to the time. Thus, change was needed to deal with these modern problems. Economics was not simply about self-interest, but again, they promoted the use of statistics and inductive reasoning to show that it covered a much larger part of the population. It was, again, not just about individual self-interest. Social scientists also employed similar methods. Pragmatism is a very significant part of American intellectual history. It called for trial and error. It argued that there are no absolutes, but literally that everything is relative. So when you hear that, everything is relative, it really it emanated from the pragmatist movement. Now, because of this, they needed to find ways to deal with problems and not simply chalk them up to outcomes of classical political economy. William James and John Dewey are associated with pragmatism. They are two of its intellectual leaders. But again, I just want to reiterate this. Pragmatism is an American philosophy, and it is essentially trial and error. Find your problem, find a potential solution. If that solution doesn't work, find another solution. So pragmatism, again, is all about relativism, and it goes into every part of life, political, social, cultural, economic. And again, James and Dewey are the leading thinkers with regard to pragmatism. But again, pragmatism very much is different from the laissez-faire mentality. So let's get back. Okay, so these are our two big sides. We've got laissez-faire, we've got the general welfare state. Why was this suddenly a big issue? What led to so much espousal of the general welfare state at this particular point in time. Now, to reiterate, there are three major avenues of change that the United States faces toward the end of the 19th century. And it really goes on throughout the century, but it escalates dramatically after Reconstruction. Industrialization, urbanization, and immigration. Our country changes fundamentally in many ways during this time. We change from a rural country to focus on more urban work and life. We have expansion into new territories. But again, all these three major avenues of change all work together. We have people immigrating to the New World, still the New World, if you will. People immigrating from Europe to find work in the United States. And where do they find this work? They mostly find it in industry. Many Americans move from the countryside to the city to work in industry. So these two, again, together then lead to more urbanization. We have more people living in the city. We have more issues related to the city. And this is what reformers will embark on, is trying to rectify the problems that they see in the city. Now, we have many reform movements. The populists are a major reform movement at this time of the century. But at the beginning of the 20th century, we see the rise of progressivism. Now, that's still a ways away, and we will get to that later. But progressivism really attacks these three problems. Now, how might one define the general welfare state? Again, I've kind of given some examples of these different groups, these different individuals, kind of their philosophy. But what they basically looked at was reform. They wanted to reform. They wanted to make change, and they believed that government can and should affect change, should try to ameliorate some of the problems of modern society. Rather than letting people and society figure it out on their own, government was needed. And to reiterate, who espoused this? Clergymen, academics, the social sciences. And in the more modern times, we associate the general welfare state, I've already mentioned progressives, but also the New Dealers. Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal during the Great Depression. Also Lyndon Johnson and his Great Society programs in the 60s. Now, I do want to touch upon one book that kind of goes into this as well. It's called The Search for Order by Robert Wiebe. Now, according to Wiebe, the nation was undergoing major changes during this time. And prior to this time, most people lived in the countryside and worked on farms, as I mentioned. We were a rural nation, the ideal proposed by Thomas Jefferson, the independent farmer, living a stable life on property he owned, etc., in control of his own labor. Now, that's a major change because in the industrial world, workers do not have control over their own labor. This is something we will get to as we move on. But as the nation expanded and it came to terms with industrialization and urbanization and the demographic changes associated with the second major wave of immigration, people looked for a sense of order to assuage the change that they faced. More people now lived in the cities and tenement houses with larger groups, often renting instead of owning their own homes. They no longer controlled their own labor. They worked, rather than working independently for themselves and their families, they now work for someone else on the clock. They earned wages rather than ownership in their craft. The new wave of immigrants was also different. No longer were people primarily from Western Europe and Protestant. These folks now came from Southeastern and Eastern Europe. They practiced Catholicism, Judaism, and Greek Orthodox Christianity. They practiced different cultures as well as religions. Now, this was a major change. And again, this is one major thing that the progressives would try to control as the 20th century would start. And again, we will get to them later. Progressives are often looked at as this positive group. They affected positive change. They tried to look out for the little person. They tried to help these new immigrants who came into the New World. But as we will see, progressives were about their own power. They were about controlling these differences. Back we used to look at the country as a melting pot, as all these different nationalities that came together, and we mixed them together. And that's what progressivism did. It took these national, international, and cultural differences and tried to put them all together and Americanize. Now, in the modern world, in the 21st century, we have true multiculturalism because we allow people and groups to practice as they see fit. We don't try to Americanize them anymore. We respect these cultural traditions. And this is significantly different than 100 years previous with progressives. Now, also, even going back further to this time frame, in the late 19th century, we have these attempts at Americanization. And again, proponents of big government would look to the government to help lead this, and many Americans had to find a way to slow down this change and procure stability. And that is what Weeby talks about, is this search for order. How do we make sense of all these changes? And that's what his book looks at. And again, this is a significant part when we look at the general welfare state and why people are now espousing a strong government, more government action. This is the way many of them sought order. So again, this week you are reading about the Gilded Age, you're reading about changes in labor and industry, you're reading about the robber barons. I will also put up a video on populism so you have a better understanding.